to battle.
Hello and welcome. My name is GuruPathik's, and today I'm going to be talking about the basics of Invoker gameplay. First question I like to answer is why Invoker? Well, this hero is extremely fun. He's got tons of different playstyles, he's got tons of different item builds, and that's because he can fit a variety of different roles throughout the game. And so that makes him really have a lot of replayability as well as be very fun, because you're constantly making little decisions throughout the game as to what spells you need, how I need to play this hero, what's my role, and I think that he adds a lot strategically to Dota, and so I have fun playing him from that perspective. He's also really rewarding. All of his skills are skill shots, basically, meaning that you don't click on a hero and then it goes to that hero. You have to actually aim them, and that can be really rewarding when you hit those combos, but also really defeating when you miss some of those combos too. Hopefully this guide will get you to the point where you start hitting those combos pretty consistently, but that isn't always the case. He's also very strong right now. A lot of people are calling him the cancer of 6.86 because he's so strong. I wouldn't go that far to say that he's that strong, but learning a hero that's this complicated is a lot easier when the hero is strong rather than when the hero loses a lot of games, because we don't like to lose as Dota players. So if you're looking to learn this hero, now would be a good time to start. And then he's also one of the best heroes in terms of improving your skills. I started learning Invoker and I became a better player because I started spamming Invoker, because he demands a lot of you. All of his spells do different things, and are position oriented and can be things like you got to have good map sense to use Sunstrike well. You got to have good understanding of micro skills to use your Forge Spirits well. You've got to understand combos and how to hit them to use your Meteor and your Deafening Blast properly, understand disables and purges and spells, and then the nuances of each of the spells. So I think he's really good for increasing your skill cap as a player. He's also kind of a gateway hero in a lot of ways. He's on that list of heroes that you don't play unless you've played Dota a lot in the past. If you're just learning, you're not going to play this list of heroes, which is Meepo, Visage, Chen, Invoker, and any of the spirits, Earth Spirit, Storm Spirit, those kinds of things. And so he's a gateway sort of to more difficult heroes in Dota. And then he's also a gateway to the mid lane. And one thing I want to show you about the popular mid players in Dota, if you look at a mid player's profile on Dota Buff, one thing you're going to notice about them is that pretty much every one of them has Invoker as their top 3 played hero, because this hero is iconic in that middle lane. That's the role that he's most often played. And you can see every hero every person who plays Dota has a flair for heroes that they like. But if you really want to learn that mid lane well, like S4 has Magnus up here as his top because he's the son of Magnus, or Meepo for Weehaw. But if you really want to be a top mid player, you've got to add Invoker to your hero pool. So from that perspective, I think he's worth learning too. And the last reason, I guess, why you should learn this hero is that when I first started playing Dota, and I played Dota for a long time, I was scared of activatable items because it was just too many buttons to press. And I think in Dota, playing a hero like Invoker, where there are a lot of buttons to press, makes you realize that it's okay to not always hit them perfectly. But if you keep practicing and working at it, then those items won't be as scary anymore. And now I buy tons of activatable items because I'm not worried that I can do it. I have the confidence in myself that I can, handle all of these different sort of inputs at the same time. Alright, that's enough about why. So base stats, things we're going to talk about with base stats. When you're talking about Invoker, his base stats are generally terrible. There's a couple of good ones, but they're mostly bad. 38 base damage, one of the lowest in the game. Really, really bad. His strength at the initial is okay. He has 540 base HP at the start. That's okay. It's not great. Definitely could be better, but puts him in the middle of the pack. His armor is a little bit on the low side at 1.8, so it's almost 2. But definitely you'd like that stat to be a little bit better. His worst stat than his base damage, in my opinion, is his movement speed, which is 280. Makes him one of the slowest heroes in the game. Only Techies is really slower than him. So that's a pretty bad base stat. And his intelligence is okay, also middle of the road. But what this hero has, and the way he makes up for this, is in his stat gain. So he gains 4 intelligence per level, which is unreal. It's one of the highest in the game. And then as you level Invoker, you actually can choose which stats you want to improve. So with each orb, I'm going to level up Invoker here a little bit. I'm going to level him up to like 5, 6 or so. With each orb, you actually gain a passive stat. And with Quas, you gain passive strength. With Wex, you get passive agility. And with Exhort, you get passive intelligence. And so as you can see, like I leveled Quas here, I get +2 strength. And then I get +2 Wex, and then +2 intelligence for leveling Exhort. And those are bonuses that are just going to stay with you throughout the game. They're not anything that you necessarily have to do to take advantage of those. You just level the skills and then they stick with you. And that's true for every single time you level them. The other thing that's cool about these orbs is that you can choose which orbs you want active at a time. So you can have up to 3 orbs active at once, right? And each orb, while active, also gives you a benefit. And when Exhort orbs are active, they give you +3 damage. So I'm going to activate 3 orbs, and you can see my damage went up by 9 because I have 3 orbs of 3 damage. And that's kind of the benefit of having them active. Wex gives you a fixed amount of attack speed per orb, and a fixed amount of a move percentage speed buff per orb. And it's 1% movement speed and then 2 attack speed per level of Wex. And so you can see my movement speed is 280 now, and it goes to 288 when I switch to all 3. And my attack speed went from 131 to 137. So here it's 137, switch back to orbs, 131. So that's kind of cool. And then with Quas, you actually gain regen. So I'm going to take some damage here. And you can see that my base regen is 1, and then when I switch all of my orbs to Quas, I lose the damage because I've swapped off of Exhort, and I gain 1 regen per second. And every time you level them, these go up. So if you level up Exhort, for example, to level 2, right, you're going to get +6 damage from each one. So you switch, now I've got +18. If I level up Wex, okay. In this section, I'm going to be talking about all of Invoker's spells and how all of his spells work. And so the first spell you've got to learn to understand is Invoke. Invoke is how Invoker accesses all of his spells. And what's interesting about this spell is leveling it increases the mana cost and also decreases the cooldown. So you're allowed to access your other spells more quickly. And what you'll see is that the cooldown at level 2 is pretty long still. It's at 17, and so most invokers will forego leveling Invoke at level 6, and they will actually pick it up at 10 and 11. 12 seconds is low enough that it's actually good enough that sometimes you can get 4 spells out in a fight, and so most level 11 invokers will have 3 levels of Invoke. But most of the time you skip it until then, and then you level it for sure at 16. And then what's neat is that if you pick up an Aghanim Scepter, it removes that mana cost and reduces the cooldown, and at level 4 it's actually a 2-second cooldown, which is really neat. First spell we're going to talk about, the way you invoke spells is by pressing your orbs. Having specific orbs active will access different spells, and having 3 Quas orbs active will activate Cold Snap. Cold Snap's a single target stun, and what's neat about this spell is you can cast it on targets, and then if you hit them afterward, they'll be mini stunned again, as long as the duration of Cold Snap hasn't fallen off of that hero. What's neat about this spell is if you look about the range is much larger than the auto attack range of Invoker, which is kind of neat, and so you can stun heroes that are a little bit out of range, and that's pretty interesting about the spell. Next one we'll talk about is Ghost Walk, which is invoked by 2 Quas orbs as well as a Wex orb. This spell, what you'll see is as you invoke spells, they will move spells to the right, and what that means is that when I invoke a third spell, it's going to get rid of this Cold Snap spell, which is kind of neat. And if I misinvoke, if I were to invoke this Ghost Walk again, you'd see that my invoke doesn't actually go on cooldown. Or if I were to invoke this Cold Snap, it'll actually switch places, and what that becomes relevant depending on which spell you want to get rid of, because sometimes you want to get rid of Ghost Walk, but you still want to have access to Cold Snap, so that can mean something. But back to Ghost Walk. Ghost Walk's really interesting because it slows enemies based on your Quas, and then it changes your movement speed based on your Wex, and if your Wex is really high, it actually makes you faster, and if your Wex is really low, then it makes you slower. When you use this spell, you basically go invisible, and you run around. And what's neat about this spell is that when you walk into people's ranges, they'll actually be revealed and slowed by your Ghost Walk. So you will give away if you're there, so don't walk into somebody who's carrying a dust. But if you're ganking with Ghost Walk, you definitely want to take advantage of that slow. So make sure you walk up and hit them, and you'll see that the slow persists for a little while. And sometimes that can be the difference between getting a kill or not. Next spell I'm going to talk about is Tornado. Tornado is invoked by Wex, Wes, Quas, so 2 Wexes and 1 Quas. And what's neat is that you can actually, the order of these don't matter. So if you have Wex, Quas, Wex, that will invoke Tornado, or Quas, Wex, Wex. All of these will invoke Tornado, and it doesn't matter. But this spell is really neat in that the distance thrown is based on Wex, and the time that they're up in the air is based on Quas. Some interesting things about the spell: you can actually use it to stack camps. Not sure when this would ever be useful, but maybe a support invoker, you end up stacking 2 camps. You just have to make sure that the creeps are up in the air during the time that they're up, and that's kind of neat. The other interesting thing about this spell is that it actually has a purge effect. And what I mean by that is that it will purge off buffs and then deal damage as the unit lands. And so if I were to say activate Fire Shield on this guy and throw a Tornado, what you'll see is that it deals damage, it lifts them, purges off the shield, and then deals damage. Just like if I were to refresh this situation, so I'm just going to change his HP back to full and Tornado him again, you'll see that he takes the exact same damage as he did before with his Fire Shield, even though the Fire Shield reduces magic damage. Next spell I'm going to talk about is EMP. EMP drains mana, and it drains mana based on your Wex, but the charge time is always a constant 2.9 seconds. And you put this down, and after 2.9 seconds it basically explodes in a pretty large AoE. And half of the mana drained will be given back to you, so that's kind of neat, especially in the late game when you're fountain camping people, because you're a really good invoker player and they can't stop you. You can just drop it in their fountain and get a bunch of mana, which is kind of nice. You can also use it in the laning phase to sort of wreck people that way. But what's important about using your Tornado and using it, comboing it with EMP as well as Meteor, is to keep in mind what level your Quas is. And so if you want to effectively get this combo off, generally if your Quas is level 3, you drop EMP and then throw your Tornado immediately after, and the timing works out pretty good to the point where it's going to hit. And then if your Quas is actually level 4, so let me level up my hero a bit. So we'll level him up 4. And if your Quas is level 4, in general, the way you want to do the combo is you want to throw the Tornado and then the EMP immediately afterwards, and that works out pretty well in terms of the timing. And then if your Quas is level 7, so max level, so I'm just going to max out my Quas, you throw the Tornado, wait till they're thrown up in the air, and wait like a quarter of a second, and the timing ends up working out pretty well there. So that's just something to think about. Next spell we'll talk about is Alacrity. Alacrity is invoked by 2 Wex orbs and an Exhort orb, and this spell gives you attack speed and damage. The damage is based on Exhort, and the attack speed is based on Wex. And so what's interesting about this spell is that when you use it, if you have auto attack on after spell, your hero will automatically attack whoever's in this range. So I recommend, if you're playing Invoker, that you go into your options tab and you take auto attack after spell off. And what that does is that when you cast Alacrity on yourself, you'll notice that you actually have control over these units. And that may or may not matter, but it causes me to miss so many last hits in the laning phase that I just decided to learn to have it off most of the time when I played Invoker. Next spell we'll talk about is Meteor. Meteor is very similar to, this is invoked with 2 Exhort orbs as well as 1 Wex. This is very similar to EMP in that it has an impact delay, except its impact delay is much shorter, and it's 1.3 seconds. The travel distance of Meteor is based on Wex, and the damage is based on Exhort. If you click a specific spot, that is the specific spot that Meteor will land, and it kind of applies a dot-like damage to heroes, so that's just something to think about with that spell. Next spell I'm going to talk about is Sunstrike. This is invoked by 3 Exhort orbs, and if you get Exhort at level 1, definitely drop that Sunstrike on the fountain to make sure that you're top damage to start the game out, because that's really important. But what's neat about this spell is that it actually deals pure damage. So if I were to Sunstrike this Lifestealer, for example, and Rage, you'll see that it deals damage. So it becomes really useful for killing off specific targets like Huskar, for example, who have high magic resistance, or anti-mage. The last thing I'm going to say about this spell is that it actually splits damage. So if I were to Sunstrike both of these guys, then you'll see that each one of them takes half damage. And this is also true of creeps, so don't sunstrike units in the middle of creep waves because you're not going to be able to do anything with them. Next spell I'm going to talk about is Forge Spirits. Forge Spirits is invoked with 2 Exhort Orbs as well as 1 Quas Orb, and you will always invoke 1 Forge Spirit unless you meet a specific criteria, and that criteria that is met is you need 4 levels of Exhort and 4 levels of Quas. And what's neat about Aghanim Scepter is that not only does Aghanim Scepter reduce the mana cost and the cooldown on your invoke, but it also gives you 1 extra orb of each. So if you're missing that extra orb and you buy an Aghanim Scepter, for example, and I were to invoke Forge Spirits like this, you'll see that I get 2. And whenever these units hit a unit, you'll see that the unit loses armor. And that is only on heroes. It does not affect Roche, it does not affect creeps, it doesn't affect anything, but just a unit related thing, and it's kind of a debuff. So that can be really neat and can combo really well with other Midas armor items. Next spell I'm going to talk about is Ice Wall. Ice Wall is one of your longest disables, and probably the spell that I criminally underuse the most, even though it's very good. It basically creates a wall in front of you that slows targets, and so if I were to slow this Lifestealer, for instance, what's neat about it is that it persists through BKB, but it will not work on BKB. So you hit someone who is able to BKB with an Ice Wall before they get it off, and they will still be slowed by it. So it's a pretty nice thing to use, like out of a Yule's, for example. The other thing that's kind of neat about it is that you kind of have to get pretty close to people to use it, but if you actually master how to quickly turn and then use it, you can actually slow people. I missed this Lifestealer just barely. But in general, you kind of want to turn at like a 45-degree angle, and that's basically how you hit targets that are right in front of you. So this is just something to think about with that spell. The last spell I'm going to talk about is Deafening Blast. And Deafening Blast is definitely a cool spell because the stun duration of Deafening Blast is based on Quas, the disarm duration is based on Wex, and the damage is based on Exhort. So it does a lot of really cool things. And if you're really good at timing this spell with your tornadoes and with your Yules, you can actually use this on targets without them being able to BKB. That one was a little off. He probably would have been able to BKB there, but the way you can tell that you're doing it right is if you Yules a target with and then Deafening Blast them. So we'll try it one more time. If you use a target and then Deafening Blast them, I was too early. You can see that sometimes they'll get pushed back towards you, and that's when you know that the timing is correct. One more time. Still a little early. Takes a lot of practice. Work on it. And then the last thing that's really interesting about Deafening Blast is that when you hit level 25, so if I were to level up to max, so we'll say level up to max, this spell actually becomes an AoE spell, which is kind of cool in that you basically have Ravage on your Invoker. So getting to level 25 is a huge incentive. And then also when you hit level 25, because of the way Invoke was changed, and so you didn't have to level it at 1 anymore because of patch 6.86, you actually gain +6 stats at the very end. What's really fun about Invoker is that he has 3 main styles of how you can play the hero, and that means he can apply to a lot of different games. And if you look at how these spells are sort of organized based on how much Quas and how much Exhort and how much Wex they take to invoke, you start to see those styles come out. There's a Quas Wex style which focuses on Cold Snap, Ghost Walk, Tornado, EMP, as well as Deafening Blast, and that's a very ganking oriented style. The Wexort is much more of a farming one-shot combo build, and that tends to use a lot of Alacrity, Chaos Meteor, and Sunstrike, some EMP, but Deafening Blast is a huge part of that as well. And then there's the Quas Exhort style, which is much more of a pushing style, which is Cold Snap, Ice Wall, Forge Spirit, Sunstrike, and Deafening Blast. And what's neat about these 3 different styles is that in general, in Dota, gankers tend to beat farmers because farmers like to stay alone and farm camps and do things like that, and so they get picked off by really good gankers. Farmers tend to beat pushers because they tend to have really good de-pushing ability spells, and then the pushers tend to beat gankers. And the reason for that is they tend to group up as 5, and it's very difficult for gankers to get ganks off in groups of 5. And so what's neat about that with Invoker is that you can choose what style you want to play based on what you're playing against. So we'll look at Wex, which is our ganking style, and the typical build for this, and we'll go over this in the playstyles part of the video, but is Phase, Urn, and Orchid. And so if I were to look at this lineup right here, right, and I was trying to decide what style I was playing, the first thing you want to consider are what are the strengths and weaknesses of that style. And so the strengths of Wex is that it's high mobility, has strong lane harass, is a space creator, and has low cooldown nukes. And then its weaknesses is that it doesn't farm very well necessarily. It's not really a damage dealer build late. It can be if you get a lot of farm or get a lot of kills. And it's weak to BKB, but that's true of pretty much all Invoker builds. And so then what you do is you start to look at your game and you say, well, hey, I've got a carry that needs space. I've got two, aggressive team fighters who like to fight early, a team fighting support, an Orchid target, and Ember. I can even purge his shield with Tornado. That sounds great. I could drain the mana from Wraith King. I've got AA who likes to farm by himself, is easy to get picked off, and Cold Snap just destroys Timbersaw. He can't Timber Chain away from anything or cast any of his spells. And I'm pretty much ungankable by Spirit Breaker because I'll just Cold Snap him if he ever charges me. So you start to see, like, this might be a good Wex game because of that. The next game, Exort, right? And the typical build for this is a very pushing style of build, which means you're usually going to build Treads and a Basilius, as well as Necrobook. And so let's look at this lineup and see, does Exort fit with this lineup? What are the strengths and weaknesses of that build? Right? The strengths is that it's really good at pushing. It's got some global presence with Sunstrike. It's really good at Roche control. Invoker can actually solo Roche with Necrobook as well as two Forge Spirits fairly early on, and then it's an armor reduction build because of the way Forge Spirits work by reducing armor. So the weaknesses is that it tends to be really low mobility. It requires farm and levels to come online, but that's very typical of all Invokers, and it's weak to BKB as well. And then what you start to say is, hey, on this team, I've got someone who likes to split push. I've got a Tower Destroyer on Rasta, an AoE team fighter in Tidehunter, and a Dragon. And you can see how this team is going to be built, right? It's basically 4 heroes are going to be pushing one lane around either Lycan or Invoker, and then the other carry or position 1 or 2 is going to be on the opposite side of the map, taking a tower by themselves. And so that's how the team starts to set up. It's a 4-1 on 2 opposite sides of the map scenario. And then you look at their lineup and you say, is Exort good against their lineup? And you've got a Skywrath who lacks D-push. You've got a weak early mid-game Spectre that you want to end the game early against. You've got heroes that rely on Invis, like Bounty Hunter, low armor targets and Pudge, as well as weak team fighters and Weaver, and it seems like a good Exort game. Then the last build is Wexort, which is more of a farming build as well as kind of a lane dominator. And the typical build with this is you're going to try to get your Yules and a Blink up early and then transition into an Ags. And so let's talk about why this game would be a good game for a Wexort Invoker, right? What are the strengths of Wexort Invoker, right? It's got really good high lane base damage, which means that he can outlast hit a lot of heroes that like to farm in lane. He's got high magical burst, which means you could just pick off targets without them being able to cast anything. And then there's still that global presence with Sunstrike. And then the weaknesses is that, this hero doesn't really have a way to get away from early mid lane ganks, as well as long cooldown nukes. Like, your combo tends to be on about a minute cooldown because you're waiting for your meteor most of the time, which is a 50-second cooldown, and then again you're weak to BKB, but there's ways to play around that. And so then you start to look at the lineups and you see, hey, I've got a fighting carry in my Gyro, I've got a deny style offlaner, so that means their carry is probably going to be poor, I've got a tanky frontliner who does a bunch of damage, so I can kind of hang in the back and pick off whoever shows up, and then I've got a ganking support to combo my Sunstrike with. That sounds great. My team's got really good synergy with the Wexort style of play. And then I look at their lineup and I say, oh, their carry's got low base HP, that's vulnerable to being comboed. I've got a Warlock, maybe I can kill him before he gets his ultimate off in team fights, and that would be amazing for us. I'll be laning against a Sniper who's got low base damage, and maybe I can just outfarm him in lane with Alacrity. That sounds pretty good. Keep him poor by denying the crap out of him. And then I've got Windrunner who relies on evasion as their offlaner, and you could just combo her down because you don't really care about the evasion. A lot of your damage just comes from magical burst. So heroes that rely on escapes can be targets for Wexort Invoker. And then same thing with like Dazzle, who is essentially just another target for that Wexort combo because he has no way to avoid it. In this section, I'm going to be covering the how to think like the Invoker. And because there's 3 main styles of how to play Invoker, I'm going to do this 3 times. So if you're interested in a particular style, click on the style that you're most interested in, and this video will take you to that link. But until then, you're stuck with the style that I picked for this video. So looking at this game, what do I feel like playing, right? Going against a Shadow Fiend in lane, who's someone who has pretty low base damage. So that makes me think I might want to go Wexort, but I'm going against a CK, so maybe some AoE would be better for that. I could also gank, like removing Omni ult with Tornado seems pretty good too. What's my lineup do? Lineup's very team fight oriented. I've got, a Jakiro and a Luna. Maybe this is a good game for Quas Exort based on my team, based on our pushing style. And this is something you're going to do at the start of every single Invoker game. What style do I want to play? What style is good? And so I think for this game, just for teaching purposes, I think I'm going to go a Quas Exort style and sort of go over the basics for that style. So most of the time when you're playing Quas Exort, opening item builds for Invoker tend to be pretty standard. Most of the time you're going to get like a null tally, as well as a couple of regen items. You can get tangos if you want to. I usually like sending out a healing salve, but usually this like opening build seems pretty good. I like buying Magic Stick though on this hero, so this build can also be viable where you get a circlet. But just for this game, I'm going to use this build, and I got to get out to mid at a specific time. Otherwise, this guy is going to decide to go mid instead of me. So hopefully I got here in time. But most of the time with Invoker, when you're choosing which spells to work towards, or which spells to level, most of the time when you're going this Quaswex style, you're going to take Exhort at 1. But I would recommend you hold off because sometimes you might want Cold Snap at level 1 to fight at the rune. So it can kind of depend. So like in this example, right, maybe I would take this so I can invoke Cold Snap and maybe try to get a kill on this Omni, right? And then with the Bounty Rune, most of the time, you're going to want to end up sending a Self out the South. Your opening item build can be very creative, though. You can build whatever you want. Usually when you go Quas, it's not the best because you're missing out on 11 damage, 2 from leveling Exhort, as well as the 9 from having the 3 orbs active. So it's kind of a detriment to level Quas at the start, so I would not recommend getting it unless you know you can get a kill. But this style of laning is very much around getting your Forge Spirits out, and then using your Forge Spirits to help you harass, or last hit, or do things like that. Unfortunately, Forge Spirits tend to not last very long at level 1, level 1 Quas. The duration is affected by Quas, and so most of the time you don't want to start summoning Forge Spirits until you hit level 2 Quas. But as you can see, I activate Exhort Orbs, so I get max damage, and then here I'm harassing, or just trying to outlast hit. You're not necessarily someone who's going to look to harass that much, but you can. Just a micro tip in general, when you summon your Forge Spirits, send your Forge Spirit away from you, because what will happen is, just like this SF did, is he'll often raise, and then you can kind of control your units together as they move closer, and then occasionally move them back apart. And that's like a really good way to micro your units in a way such that you're not necessarily going to get hit by those AoE nukes. And as you can see, they kind of move back closer together. But when you're playing this, you got to be thinking about what level my Quas is, as well as when you send out your Forge Spirits. Because you can use your Forge Spirits to do a variety of things. You can use your Forge Spirits to check runes. You can use your Forge Spirits to stack camps. You can use them to scout out ganks. You have lots of different options. And so like right here, this guy just died up here. But that's alright. But most of the time what's going to happen, and you're going to like to do this against ganking mid heroes, so usually when I go this build, a lot of the times I'll go boots first, and then if I needed a little bit of extra gold, or the next item that I would work towards would most likely be a Basilius, so I'll just give myself a little bit of gold, pretend like I was actually trying to farm this game. And these are kind of like the early game items I would buy. Gold 250. So, and the reason for the Basilius is mostly to both buff up your Forge Spirits, but you can also toggle your Basilius to help you push. And so most of the time you want to be picking this like Quas Exort style of Invoker versus a hero that will leave the lane. And so now I'm just going to bully him and force him to leave the lane. But you can get a lot of kills on heroes that have low armor values, which is what that guy does have. But what's neat about pushing these towers is that you can toggle your Basilius, right, to help you push. And that's mostly to keep your creeps alive. And so I'm just going to refresh so I can cast another Forge Spirit. Because when you're pushing a tower like this, a lot of the times you want to time your push around having that siege creep. But you can use your Forge Spirit to pull the wave. Let's try this again because I got him killed. But you send your Forge Spirit past the tower, and what you do is you pull the wave. So your hero is hitting the tower, right? And you're using your Forge Spirit to pull the wave away. And it basically gives you a little extra time to hit the tower. This is something that's very commonly done by Bulldog on his Nature's Prophet when he's pushing towers. That's actually the guy that I learned it from. So pretty interesting fact, or interesting way to play it. But what you can see is that when you have your Quas Orbs up, you hit actually very hard. And in general, when you're playing this style, the early laning phase is about getting as much farm as you can get, and pushing down the tower every time this hero leaves the lane. You're using Forge Spirits to deny runes. That's like the biggest thing. You can also use them to stack camps and then come back and farm them later. That's another thing that you're doing. But that's the laning phase for this hero mostly. And you can take advantage of heroes like Pudge, and when you get this tower down, like, it doesn't even matter that Pudge got a kill off on your safe lane because you gave your whole team 200 gold. God, this SF's getting annoying. Just want to kill him. But you can kill him. The other thing to be thinking about during the laning phase is you can be using Sunstrike as well. So, like, you can invoke. These are usually the spells that I would have invoked. Sometimes I would switch to Cold Snap if I needed it. But you want to be checking the other lanes, like if something's happening here, because you can drop a Sunstrike and maybe get a kill. It's impossible to Sunstrike bots. Bots, like, know it's coming, so they dodge it. But you can sometimes get them. They, like, program bots to be a little stupid sometimes. But if this tower has died, one of the things you can do, you can either choose to rotate to another lane, or you can choose to rotate into the jungle. It really just kind of depends on the game. I would recommend that you rotate to a lane, though, because this hero is more geared towards ending the game early. And the item build that you're usually working towards, a lot of the times I like going Strength Treads, and I like getting a stick. Mostly because this hero, like, when you play this style, you don't have that much escapability. So a lot of what you're going to be doing is you're going to be tanking, and this just gives you extra HP as well as a little extra survivability in a fight. But the item you're going to work towards mostly is a Necro Book. Now, everyone's going to ask, is Midas the item that you buy on Invoker? And I think you can buy Midas on any style of Invoker. The only disadvantage of it is that it delays you by about 2 to 3 minutes. In terms of having your impact based on what it is. You get your Yules up 2 or 3 minutes later, you get your Necro Book up a little later, but it does help you transition into the late game a little better. So Midas is a tricky item. I think it's good on Invoker most of the time, but I'm not including it in these builds, mostly because it's not the core functionality of how you play that build. So in general, these are the items you're going to work towards. And your goal by 8 to 10 minutes or so, is to have this tower completely pushed down and have their mid basically denied 2 to 3 of their runes, as well as 40 to 50 last hits. That would be my goal. Then what happens is sort of what happens in the mid game, which is basically we're going to level up once. So around 8 to 9 minutes, 10 minutes we'll say, you're going to hit the point where you have 4 levels of Quas and 4 levels of Exhort. And what does that mean? You get 2 Forge Spirits. So you become infinitely scarier in lane as well as much faster at pushing. So here, if I'm pushing, I'm using this. Another cool thing about Forge Spirits, you can send them up the hill to scout ganks, so to avoid dying in some situations. But here, you're just going to want to work on your micro control. And again, we're pushing this tower down. So here, creeps are spawning. So instead of fighting them, what I'm going to do is send the Forge Spirit past the tower, hit the tower, pull the creep wave. And you can see, this is a very efficient way of killing towers, especially when you have siege creeps. Time your pushes around when you have siege creeps. Siege creeps spawn at 3 minutes, and then every 3 minutes and 30 seconds after that. Okay? In general, though, when you're farming on this hero, let's get some extra gold. There's a point where you can sneak into Roche, and usually that point is when you complete your first Necrobook. Mostly because the first Necrobook gives you enough damage to allow you to do it. So I'll wait for the courier to get back to me, and we'll try to get this tower down in the meantime. Come on, courier. Yeah, die creep. But this is kind of the basic style of what's going on. So you get this tower down. You can choose to keep farming the jungle if you want to. You can choose to keep doing other things. It doesn't matter. But once you get into here, you basically just end up popping your Forge Spirits. And you can use your Cold Snap as well. You don't necessarily have to. But, so you pop your Forge Spirits. You pop your Necrobook. You go to Roche. And the big thing is just to keep this guy alive, so you don't necessarily want him dying. So you kind of want to split your armor. And if you're good about it, then you can set up, like, spread out your creeps in such a way that Roche doesn't clap. But that requires a little bit of micro, and so that's just something you're going to have to practice. This is something that takes a little bit of time, and a lot of times, most invokers, when they're doing this, they will actually wait till they're level 9, because then they have a point in Wex, and that gives them access to Alacrity. And Alacrity makes doing Roche much, much faster. So I would recommend doing it at level 9. That's kind of like the ideal. You can do it earlier than that if you want to, but as you can see, like, still a very easy thing for me to do. Then what's going to happen in these games is once you get this tower down, and once you get the Roshan, basically, you usually can get that around minute 12 to 13, you're going to want to be going to other lanes. And people are going to group up mid like this. They're going to want to team fight. That's not what you do with this hero, right? You get to lanes, you get there, and you get your Forge Spirits out. You get, you know, your Necrobook. Let's say your Necrobook was off of cooldown, and you start pushing towers, and you have Sunstrike up at all times. And the goal here is for you to basically deal as much damage to these towers while watching these team fights, dropping Sunstrikes where you think you can get heroes that Necro turned around. I wasn't paying that much attention. But you are objective based. That's how you play these games. Objectives, objectives, objectives. And that's what you focus on in the early game. And the way you contribute to your team is that you're not as fast of a pusher as Lycan, for example, but you are a but you can provide something to the team fights with your Sunstrike, is that's something that a Lycan can't do. And that's kind of what makes your hero a little bit different. So that's kind of how the mid game goes. And then what you continue to do is you basically continue farming, continue doing your thing, continue solo picking off people who come to defend your pushes, right? With Forge Spirits, Cold Snap. You can even use Ice Wall as well. There's a lot of different options. And then you basically keep doing that until their whole map is dead. And once their whole map is dead, what do you keep doing? You keep doing Roche, and then you just keep chipping away at towers. It's a very early game oriented invoker. And I think for that reason, I generally don't like my... On to the next style of invoker. And we'll see what style I end up picking. I'm picking between Quas Wex now and Wexort, based on kind of the heroes that we're looking at. So in this game, right, I'm going to be going up in lane against a Tiny, who, you know, that's a hero that I can harass really well, as well as a hero that I probably could deny really well if I went Wexort. Or I might be against a Razor. I would definitely go Wexort versus the Razor, mostly because I'd need the Alacrity to outfarm him, and he can't really contest me with that. So it depends on who will show mid. Definitely some targets who are going to be farming alone though. Sand King likes to farm the jungle by himself, so maybe I pick up a Dust, so Wexort would be good from that perspective. My team, on the other hand, I've got some extra damage, you know, some pushing, as well as some stuns. There's nothing too specific about my team that makes me want to build a certain way, but I think I'm going to go Wexort this game, mostly based on what my laning siege will be. And when you're going a Wexort Invoker build, this is also a very standard build, but most of the time you want the Null Tally. Same thing, you can go like the early Magic Wand build. Some people like doing the double Fairy Fires, or even the like single Fairy Fire plus an Ironwood branch, and then you get Pool to Tango, which is kind of cool because that way you can actually, you know, put down a tree and eat your tree, and you're effectively getting 2 Pool Tangos, so that can be a really interesting build. But same thing as before. wait to level your orbs because you don't know exactly which orb you're going to need. It's definitely fun to level Sunstrike and throw it into the fountain right at the start. So if you're interested in doing that, you can. But most of the time what you're going to do is hopefully secure a rune for yourself. This game I'm not going to get one. But with that opening rune, let's say I got that rune, you're going to again send yourself out of salve. And one of the biggest laning mistakes that I see with invokers, I'm just going to refresh, pretend like I never used a Sunstrike. One of the biggest laning mistakes I see with invokers is that they tend to sit on their quas for regen rather than sending out regen and being on their orbs that actually do things. Because quas orbs, yes, they regen your HP, and you should try to take advantage of that when you can. But when you're at 200 HP, for example, you don't necessarily want to be sitting on quas orbs for, if you're getting 3 regen a second, that's a long, long time. 100 seconds before you'll gain 300 HP back. So send out regen, don't be afraid to. But with this build, a lot of how you play, and most of the time, I've kind of pushed this wave, and that's pretty much a mistake. But most of the time, you're going to take Sunstrike at 1, and you're going to get Wexort, your Wex as your next point, so that you can open Alacrity. And then once you have Alacrity, you're basically going to use Alacrity to help last hit as well as harass. Same thing with most other builds though, you're definitely going to want to go boots first. You've got to correct that early movement speed. Yes, you have some movement speed by switching to Wex, which is an advantage of the this build, but in general you're going to be leveling Exhort. So same thing as always though, you use your Alacrity, helps you last hit. Alacrity is really interesting. It got nerfed fairly recently, so the bonus attack damage is much, much lower at level 1. So the value of putting a second point of Exhort early is really, really good, because it goes from 10 damage bonus to 25. And what you'll notice is that when you use Alacrity, you can see how much damage I have. It's insane, right? Like, there's no hero in Dota at 2 minutes that can contest this level of damage. And that's part of the reason why Wexort Invoker is a very, very strong laner. In general, you're not going to control the runes as a Wexort Invoker, mostly because you're not going to have Forge Spirits, and you're generally not going to want to leave your lane. And the way you do your laning phase most of the time is kind of like a static equilibrium farming fest, because there's no way they can contest your last hits. So most of the time your goal is to leave it here, and then if they walk into range, you're welcome to hit them. But the goal of this lane, I would say in the early laning phase, is just to get as much farm as you can. And I think this build, in terms of items to work towards, you definitely kind of want to be working towards that Yules. That would be the item that affects your playstyle. But I think this build is definitely most suited to building Midas. Most of the time at level 4 here, I end up taking a point in Quas, and the main purpose of that is so I can get Cold Snap. And now I become an extremely fearsome laner, especially against weak ones. You can walk up the hill, go up Cold Snap, Alacrity, movement speed, and you can see how much damage I deal. Kind of messed up some of my auto attacks there. Do I not have a salve on the courier? Never bought a salve. I was like wondering where it was. But same thing as Quas Exhort, you're definitely going to be looking to other lanes looking for Sunstrike opportunities. And it can be difficult to keep track of what's going on in other lanes. So most of the time what I do is, instead of just looking at lanes constantly and seeing what's going on, just ask your teammates to ping, right? Say, hey, if you're going to go for a kill, just ping. And then you react to the pings. So in the laning phase, most of the time when I'm playing with an Invoker, I will actually ping so that he has some idea of what's going on. You can get kills that way too, which is kind of nice. What you'll find often too is that your spells cost quite a bit of mana, and in the early game you're not necessarily going to have enough to spam them, sort of like I'm doing. Alacrity doesn't cost that much, so you can actually kind of spam that spell, but you're going to run into these situations where you run out of mana quite often. And if you're working towards a Midas or something, or some sort of regen item, a lot of times you'll see Invoker maybe go early Void Stone, and that can be okay. But just don't be afraid to send yourself out clarities, right? Because you're sitting back, you're hanging back in lane in positions that you're not necessarily going to be taking a lot of damage most of the time. And the reason you're doing that is you're kind of vulnerable to being ganked. So you're hanging back, doing a lot of damage, and clarities can get a lot of value, especially in terms of that. So items to work towards, right? Usually with this skill build, you can choose to put more points in Quas or Wex right now. Like, I think this is definitely preference. The standard build most of the time is 1, 3, 4. That's like the standard what you would do at level 9. Or at level 10, I mean. I guess that would be level 9. But you can choose to put your points in Quas, or you can choose to put your points in Wex. It really doesn't matter. I think most builds will end up doing this, where you end up going Wex, and this really makes your alacrity powerful, especially because of that movement speed. I think in terms of boots, for this hero, a lot of Wexort Invokers will just stay on the brown boots and go Midas into Yules, and that can be okay, especially because the Yules gives you movement speed. But I usually prefer going phase boots, because phase boots is definitely a lane dominating kind of boot, and I think that this style of Invoker is definitely suited towards getting those phase boots. So then what's going to happen is eventually you're going to work towards enough gold to have your Yule Scepter. And I'm just going to give myself enough gold to do it. I'm going to send it out on the courier. And then what you're going to want to start doing is you're going to want to start setting up for your Yule's Sunstrike Meteor combo. And when I'm talking about this combo, the order is Yule's Sunstrike Meteor. And the reason for that is, right, Sunstrike has a 1.7 second delay, Meteor has a 1.3 second delay, and then Deafening Blast, which is the last spell of that combo, is basically instant. You know, I mean, it takes a little while for the Deafening Blast to fly to the target. But the important thing to think about with this combo is that how much mana all of these spells cost, right? Sunstrike is 175, Meteor is 200, Yule's is 175, so everything costs basically 200 mana, and then Deafening Blast itself is 200 mana. So you need like 750 mana to basically cast this. A little bit more because you have Invoke. So definitely consider your mana pool for those reasons. You can see how I invoked in that order specifically. But like I said, once you have this combo, most of the time, if somebody comes to lane against you, you kind of walk up to them. You make sure to Yules them when they're not near a target so that your Sunstrike doesn't miss. And then you drop the combo sort of like that. The advantage of leveling up Quas is that your Deafening Blast will stun for a little bit longer, but the advantage of leveling up Wex is that your alacrity is a little faster. And so 3-1-4 is common, 1-3-4 also common. You just have to think about the strengths and weaknesses of each. I generally prefer getting the Quas, but that's just me. Now once you have your Meteor combo, in general you're going to want to keep farming. And the goal is to pick off a Blink. And the reason I say Blink is because Blink allows you to instantly reposition and is very good at allowing you to combo people. You can continue to push down towers with Alacrity and play very similar to like a Quas Exhort style, but instead of using Forge Spirits, you're using Alacrity to hit towers, and that can be good as well. But most of the time, once you have these items up, you're going to be looking for ganks. And what I mean by that is you want to be farming their jungle with Alacrity, right? Let me set up the spells properly. So you're going to want to have your spells sort of set up like this. The trick is especially when you have this level 1 invoke, is you have to really anticipate very well because the cooldown is very long. And then as you can tell, like the cooldown on Sunstrike is 25 seconds, so it's not that long, but Meteor is 55, and it's your longest cooldown spell. So you're not going to be able to do this combo very often. But what you want to be doing is you're going to want to be looking for people who are by themselves or who are easy to combo. And so, for example, this Razor is pretty low, but I'm just going to combo him anyway. But it's the same kind of thing. You snowball your advantage. I think most of the time in the early game, you can use Deafening Blast if you want to in this combo, and I think it's recommended if you have 3 levels of Quas. But you'll actually get more damage out if you use Cold Snap afterward. So that's definitely something to think about with the build. This build is about getting ahead early and often, and as you get ahead, you basically punish people who don't have the items to handle you. And what you'll notice is how much damage this combo deals. It deals quite a lot, right? I'm currently level 9, which is not necessarily an extremely high level, but it's pretty high level for this game. But Meteor is basically going to do somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400 damage with level 5 Exhort. then you're going to have 200 damage from level 5 Exhort, and then your Sunstrike does an additional 350 pure damage. So if we're looking at damage at level 5 Exhort, you're basically dealing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 damage to a target. And if you look at people's HP in this pool, in this minute, you've got 864, you've got 10 like 1,000. So look for those targets with those low base HPs. Then let's see, we'll do refresh. Let's see if we can combo down this Razor from full HP. I want to see if I have enough damage at level 4. Oh, he's too fast. Oh, the creeps got in the way. But you can see, lots and lots of damage. Drow did a little bit there, but you definitely deal tons and tons of damage. Then usually with this build, most of the time, the reason that you get, so you'll go blink, and that'll help your mobility, that'll allow you to pick people off as well as use it kind of as an escape plan. But the main reason that people go Ags a lot of the time is to extend the lifeline of how long you can kill people with that combo. Because as you can see, like the damage eventually will fall off to the point where you're not allowed to kill targets, and that extra point in Exhort really helps towards getting that. So in general though, combo people down, push towers with Alacrity, win your lane with Alacrity, deny the crap out of them. And in this section of the video, I'm going to be covering how to think like a Wexort Invoker. So Wexort Invoker is a little bit different, mostly because he's going to be investing most of his points into Quas and Wex, and then not really any into Exhort, though it is tempting to invest 1 point in Exhort early for that early 11 damage in lane, and that's definitely viable. You can do that as Quas Wex, but for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to. In terms of looking at the game for Quas Wex, right? Quaswex a very good ganker, so he likes to pick people off for him by themselves, and like if Axe was jungling, maybe Quaswex would be really good for this game, but I bet he's in the off lane because these are bots and they don't really jungle. But he's very good at killing low HP supports, sort of like this Witch Doctor and sort of like this CM or Skywrath. Like all of those heroes are vulnerable, even this sniper. So from that perspective, it's very good. You can go no Tali if you want to with this opener, but a lot of the times I actually prefer going for a Blade of Attack. It's a little bit cheaper and it gives you the same amount of damage. And then that way what you can do is like you can go a Blade of Attack early damage. Like the goal is to get as much damage as possible early, especially because you're considering not taking that early point in Exhort. You definitely don't have to, but you can. And I think most invokers, when they go Quaswex, will actually take their first point in Quas. Because most of the time you're going to be putting more points into Quas early, and then once your Wex is high enough, then you truly become a Quaswex invoker. But a lot of the times in the laning phase you're going to be sitting on Quas, and that makes this kind of style of invoker very good against other heroes that are really good lane harassers. So the Linas, the Zeuses of the world, like those you could just buy tangos, send out a salve, get an early magic stick, that kind of thing. But the main reason behind getting this Blades of Attack is, yes, it's the same amount of damage as a null, and so it's like, why not get the extra stats? But the point is when you buy your phase boots eventually, you're gaining, like, if you look at phase boots, the item itself gives 24 damage, but each Blade of Attack gives +9 damage. So in the recipe, you're essentially gaining a 6 bonus damage, so it benefits you more once you've finished it. Oh, we got an Axe in lane. Crazy. But mostly as a Quaswex Invoker, you're going to play really aggro. And what I mean by that is you're going to be playing around last hits, so like here I'm going for a last hit. But every time there's no last hit available, you get on their hill, you get aggressive, you fight them early, and then you make sure you're not tanking too many creeps. Most of the time you can tank a little bit of your creeps, but this is kind of the aggro laning style you want to play. Most people aren't going to let you bully them that much, mostly because they aren't bots. But what you can do here, a lot of the times, like the spell that you invoke at level 2 doesn't matter that much. EMP is okay, but EMP at this point only burns 100 mana and will only give back basically 50 mana. So in terms of using it, like you're going to lose 75 mana to cast it at level 1, so it's not usually that great. And most of the time in lanes, like especially if I'm getting heavily harassed, I'll actually take a second point in Quas at this point. It's also kind of a value point for Cold Snap, because if you look at Cold Snap, the damage basically doubles. But this is the general idea. You play aggro in your lane when you're not getting last hits, and get as much farm as you can, and work yourself towards those phase boots. And I'm just going to give myself enough gold to buy kind of the next item in that line. Quaswex Invoker is a very different style of Invoker in that most Invokers aren't going to contest the rune, or instead going to use their Forge Spirit to contest the rune. Quaswex Invoker actually has enough movement speed with all of his Wex Orbs up that it's actually worth contesting the rune a lot of the time. And controlling the rune is definitely much more of a like ganking style of Invoker, and so definitely something you want to be thinking about. But in general, these phase boots synergize really nicely with your Wex, because Wex gives you more attacks per instance, as well as more movement speed, and that just works really nicely with Wex, with phase boots. Then the next item in general that you kind of want to build is more like an urn. And the reason I say you generally want to build like an urn, or build an urn, is that what's cool about urn is that it procs all of your cold snaps. So this is another reason why you level up your quas a little bit higher on this style of Invoker, is that it ends up being a really good harassment tool. And if you want to, like if you get tired of this guy calling, using spells in the mid lane, you can actually drop EMPs on them. You drop them in positions such that they kind of have to run through them, and you can get rid of their mana that way. So that's another way to like fix the, oh, I'm getting harassed and I don't know what to do problem. Again, don't be afraid to send yourself out salves. It's not a big deal. Like, you don't always want to be sitting on these orbs, the healing orbs. You definitely want to be using your more aggressive orbs when you can. But most of the time you're going to take 3 points in quas, mostly because that's like you can combo your tornado EMP extremely well. Another thing you want to be thinking about in the laning phase is that your hero is very good at killing the enemy hero in lane. And a lot of the times, like, you want to pick them against sort of weak laners, you know, the Storms or the low range heroes of the world. And what you do is you tell your teammates, hey, I want to come gank this axe. Because if you've got a hero like, we don't necessarily have it on this team, but if you had a Sand King, right, and this Sand King wanted to gank the lane, or anyone with a stun, you can actually set up those kills really easily. So since Quas is level 3, I'm going to EMP, then Tornado, switch to my Cold Snap, change my orbs back to Wex Orbs, and then hit him. And you can see, like, the Tornado setup into another stun is usually a free kill. So if you see a Quaswex Invoker in your game, look to gank his lane right around this time, right around that 4-minute mark, when he's got Tornado up and a couple of his spells. One of the things I see with Quaswex Invokers is that they kind of sit in the lane and they wait until they farm their Orchid. And I think, you know, you're not necessarily using the hero to its full potential at that point, because you don't actually need an Orchid at this point to get kills. You actually just need this urn and phase boots. Again, this style of Invoker, these spells don't cost nearly as much, right? EMP is only 125, Tornado is only 150, but you're not actually getting any benefit from leveling Exhort, so you're not getting bonus intelligence. So even though the spells cost less, it actually is still pretty hard on your mana pool, so again, don't be afraid to send yourself out of clarity. But most of the time what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to push the wave, and I push it with auto attacks, right? I don't have a nuke in particular that I can use. I can use Tornado if I want to push the wave, but it's kind of a waste of mana. And because I want to be someone who's controlling the runes and moving around in the game, a lot of the times I'll do this kind of push farming style. And then what'll happen is, in the time that the wave is pushing, so I'm not missing anything, I'll work my way to top and I'll say, hey, maybe I can get a gank off here. Now, time your ganks at intelligent times, right? Like, this gank is not worth it if you're running through a rune ward. But if they obviously can't see you, then yeah, it's free kills and you can definitely take them. So here, again, I'm ganking. Try to hit 2 with the Tornado. Got 2. Cold Snap 1. And go for 2. And this is kind of the general idea. You're more of a ganking style of Invoker. And what's really important about this Invoker is getting that first urn stack. Because once you get that first urn stack, you can definitely start to make things happen. You can pick up your Orchid from the side shop, start to build it that way. I also think Yule's Next is a really good item, but most of the time you're going to go Quas, Wex, and then you'll just kind of max Wex from this point, take your point and Exhort when you can. And that's the general opening item build. But things to be careful of are people pushing your tower when you leave the lane. So most of the time what you're going to do is you're going to run to a gank, and then you're going to TP back to your lane to take the farm. And again, same thing, right? This guy's annoying, burn all his mana. What becomes nice is once you have once you have your first piece of your orchid, mana is really no issue for you anymore, and you can kind of do as you please. And I think at this point, you know, I said most of the time on Invoker, you're kind of going to wait to level your Invoke until 10 and 11. But Quaswex Invoker is a little different because he doesn't necessarily want to put more points than 3 into Quas. So you can actually take Invoke at level 8 with this hero, or you can choose to put your early point in Exhort. It really doesn't matter. Most Invokers I know right now are opening it just for Alacrity, just because Alacrity is literally strong in 6.86, but you know, things may change. Again, make sure you check their mana before you go, right? A tornado like that doesn't necessarily do anything, but it's on a low cooldown. And same thing. Now, what's going to happen is eventually you're going to finish your Orchid. And once you finish your Orchid, usually in that time of the game, it's going to be somewhere around 15 to 18 minutes. Like if you're really fast, you can get your Orchid done in, you know, 12 minutes or so, but most of the time that's because you hit a bunch of successful ganks. But when you're looking to do that, you definitely want to set up your skills in such a way that you're allowed to gank people. So I'm going to give myself some gold just for the Orchid. And what you're going to do is, let's finish this Orchid, is you're going to set your skills up in a ganking style of way. But what I'm talking about ganking style of way is I also have an escape plan. What I mean by that is I have Ghostwalk invoked, it's on my first skill. I have Cold Snap, and it's on my second skill. So what's going to happen is I'm going to use Ghostwalk, which has a relatively long cooldown, 40 seconds. But if I'm using it to run to this top lane, for example, to pick off this Skywrath, by the time I get there, Ghostwalk will usually be off cooldown. And the goal is what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to get to that lane, walk in to get the slow on Ghostwalk, Orchid, then stun him, then drop my urn, and if I need an extra spell, I can invoke an extra spell. But I have Ghostwalk to get out. I think a lot of gankers, you know, and what's unique about this style of ganking is that it's very much like how a Clinks would play, in that you can get out as well as get in with Invis. So definitely use Ghostwalk for those kinds of purposes. And what's your goal in trying to do this, trying to get all these ganks off, is one, to gank and then take a tower, right? Turn your ganks into objectives. The other reason would be to like delay some sort of late game, like a sniper or something coming online. But most of the time you're looking for these heroes who are alone. And the reason for that is you want them to group up as 5. That's what Quaswex Invoker's main goal is force the enemy team to group up as 5. And then what I see a lot of Quaswex Invokers do, which is kind of a big mistake in terms of how to play the hero, is once they group up as 5, they will continue to group up as 5. Or they will continue to try and gank them. And that's not the right play, right? Invoker's a hero that scales really well, and a lot of the times when you're playing this ganking style, like, this is where opening Alacrity is actually really beneficial. So if I level up once, right, you're a ganker, and the idea is that there's an invisible Invoker running around, so these guys have to be super scared. Granted, they aren't because they're bots, but you want to be farming in the jungle the whole time, right? Using Alacrity, which is totally fine for farming. You can use urns to self-heal yourself, but most of the time you're creating map pressure through being off the map, but yet you're still scaling towards the late game because you're farming. And this is like an advanced sort of like ganking style where you create pressure. Now, there's tons of other ways that you can gank people using Invis. Like, Cold Snap is not the universal spell that you want to be using out of your Ghostwalk all the time. Sometimes using Ice Wall can be really good as well, especially with Orchid. The slow is actually much better and allows you to kite people, sometimes better than Cold Snap, so I prefer that sometimes. If you're looking to gank like if you're looking to gank a Wraith King, for example, you know, you can sort of set your spells up like this. Ghostwalk to a specific location, drop the Ice Wall, invoke EMP, wait for the EMP to kill the target, because it will burn the mana before the damage hits. So that's kind of a unique thing, but I missed the Ice Wall. But same thing. Set up your EMP, drop your Orchid, drop your Urn. The only thing about having an urn is that most of the time you want to use Cold Snap with the urn, but you definitely don't have to. There's lots of combinations of spells that work for those ganking. And then from this point, your goal is to just max your Wex, and then you start putting points in Exhort, and eventually... Congrats on making it this far through the video. I gotta say, if you're still here, then you probably really want to try Invoker. So I'm going to try to sum up everything as quickly as I can. So what build do I go on this hero, right? You got Quas Wex, which is that ganking style. You're a space creator. You're a team fight disabler. That's where you play him. You know, you're a Quas Exhort, where you're the pusher, you're the objectives, you're the late game, and you try to end the game at such an early stage that your hero is the strongest on the map when you do. And then there's the Wexort style, where you farm, you pick up your items, you wombo combo people, and then you late game magical burst people down like crazy. Quas Wex, you build phase, earn orchid. You usually go disable or utility items to support your kind of role within the game. Quas Exhort, you tend to go Treads, Bassy, Necro, and then other right-click items that facilitate your pushing. Those can be AC, those can be Scotty, Deso, those kinds of things. And then if you're Wexort, you go for the Yule's Blink Ags, and then on top of that you start buying Refresher Octarine and throwing ridiculous combos out there. But what makes Invoker great, and part of the reason why I love him so much, is that everything I told you in this video is all just basic principles, and what makes the hero unique is that you can play the laning phase like a Wexort Invoker and transition into a mid game that's Quas Exhort, and then play the late game like a Quas Wex. You can play a Quas Exhort style while still building Wexort items. You can play a Quas Wex style and yet still build right click items. It doesn't matter. You're playing the same hero, and that hero is Invoker. Alright. Time to disconnect. Never happened. I didn't die to bots. Never saw it. Never.